The late afternoon sun bathed the front porch in a soft amber hue as I adjusted my silk blouse and smoothed down the pleats of my beige skirt. I wasn't sure why I felt the need to fuss over my appearance. The blouse was already pristine, and I had worn the skirt countless times. But as the sound of a car engine echoed down the quiet suburban street, my heartbeat quickened in a way I hadn't felt in years. A familiar black sedan pulled into the driveway. Alex stepped out, taller and broader than I remembered. His once boyish face was now framed by a sharper jawline, a confidence in his stride that hadn't been there before. My breath caught for just a second. It was absurd. I was 69 years old, not some schoolgirl with a crush. "Alex," I greeted with a smile as warm as I could muster. "Linda." His voice was deeper now, richer, and it seemed to hang in the air between us. He moved closer, pulling me into a brief embrace. His arms were firm, but what struck me most was how his hand lingered a moment longer than necessary as it slid away from my back. I told myself it was nothing. The house felt smaller with him inside, as though his presence filled every room. Dinner was a modest affair: roast chicken, potatoes, and a bottle of wine I had opened to mark the occasion. We sat at the dining table, the soft hum of conversation threading between the clink of forks and the occasional laughter. "So, how's the city treating you?" asked George, his voice full of paternal pride. "You must be a real heartbreaker out there, huh?" I forced a smile at George's comment, though my hand trembled slightly as I lifted my wineglass. Heartbreaker. The word pressed itself into my mind like an accusation. Alex's gaze flicked to mine for the briefest of seconds, unreadable but deliberate. Alex leaned back, folding his arms across his chest with a small chuckle. "I'm not sure about that. The city is fast, but it's good to be here again." I focused on my plate, taking slow, measured bites, though my appetite had vanished the moment Alex walked through the door. George, oblivious, launched into a story about an old fishing trip, while Alex nodded in all the right places. I sat there, a spectator in my own life, feeling as though I were balancing on the edge of something invisible but perilous. Later that night, the house was still. George had gone to bed early, the way he always did after a glass of wine. Bruno, our golden retriever, lay sprawled near the fireplace, his rhythmic breathing the only sound. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled from the hallway, followed by sharp barks. I slipped out of bed, grabbing my silk robe as I padded down the hall barefoot. "Bruno, what is it?" I whispered, but the dog had already darted toward the kitchen. The kitchen light was off, but the dim moonlight streaming through the window was enough to see him, Alex, standing by the counter with a glass of water in hand. His face was illuminated just enough to reveal a trace of surprise and something else. Something that made the space between us feel heavier. "Sorry," he said softly, setting the glass down. "I didn't mean to wake anyone." "It's fine," I murmured, suddenly aware of the cool tiles beneath my feet and the faint scent of his cologne, woodsy, with a hint of something sweet. Bruno stopped barking and wagged his tail, as if he too felt the charged atmosphere. Alex leaned against the counter, his eyes searching mine in the semi-darkness. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, almost as if the question had escaped his lips unbidden. I blinked. "Miss what?" "Being young, feeling like anything was possible." His words were like a slow-burning flame, warming parts of me I thought had long turned cold. I swallowed hard, forcing a chuckle that felt brittle. "That's what memories are for." Alex didn't laugh. He looked at me with a quiet intensity that unsettled me more than I cared to admit. "Memories can't touch you." There was nothing romantic or whimsical about that statement, just an honest observation. But it landed with the weight of a confession. The moment stretched thin, like a string pulled too tightly. Beneath the quiet hum of the refrigerator, I could hear my own heartbeat. I glanced down at Bruno, who was now resting peacefully, as if the moment didn't concern him at all. "You should get some sleep," I whispered, though my own feet felt rooted to the floor. Alex hesitated, nodded once and walked past me, his arm brushing mine just lightly enough to leave a ghost of warmth behind. Long after the kitchen door had swung closed behind him, I stood there in the half-darkness, the moonlight catching the edges of the empty glass he'd left behind. I thought of his words, his gaze, and that single fleeting touch. And for the first time in years, I felt unmistakably awake. The morning was unusually crisp, the kind of morning that made the air feel cleaner somehow. I tightened my coat around me and clipped Bruno's leash as he wagged his tail eagerly. A walk through the park always helped me clear my mind, or so I told myself. But today, the park felt like a stage, and I wasn't sure who was writing the script. Bruno trotted ahead, pulling me gently toward the familiar gravel path. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering secrets I couldn't quite make out. As we rounded the corner near the old stone bench, I noticed someone sitting there, head tilted back slightly as if soaking in the sky. It was Alex. I froze for half a breath, then forced myself to keep moving as though it were any other day, as though I hadn't replayed our midnight conversation in my mind 100 times since last night. "Morning?" he called, a lazy smile spreading across his face. His dark sweater clung to his frame, and his hair was tousled in a way that looked accidental, but perfect. "Morning," I replied, hoping my voice sounded steady. Bruno trotted right up to him, wagging his tail furiously. "Traitor," I thought with a wry smile. Alex reached down, ruffling Bruno's fur with the kind of ease that made it impossible not to like him. "You're up early," he noted, standing. His height felt more imposing in the open air, but his expression was soft, inviting. "It's my morning routine," I said, adjusting Bruno's leash unnecessarily. "What about you?" I needed some air, and maybe a good conversation. He looked at me meaningfully, his eyes warm. "Join me for a coffee." There it was, simple and harmless. And yet I felt like the ground beneath my feet had shifted just a little. I hesitated, my mind racing with silent protests. But my heart betrayed me before I could form a polite excuse. "Sure," I heard myself say. The small cafe at the edge of the park was quiet that time of morning. We found a table near the window, sunlight spilling across the polished wood. The smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries wrapped around us like a comforting embrace. Alex stirred his cup thoughtfully before looking up. "You know, I've always admired you, Linda." I blinked, taken aback. "Admired me? Why?" He smiled, but there was no humour in it, only a kind of sincerity that was disarming. "Your grace, the way you carry yourself, you're timeless." His hand rested on the table, close enough that if I moved mine just slightly, our fingers would touch. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks. My heart was suddenly in my throat, thundering against my ribs. I forced myself to take a sip of coffee, hoping the warmth would steady me. "You make it sound like I'm a painting in a museum," I said lightly, though my voice was softer than I'd intended. "No." He leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You're real. That's what makes you incredible." For a few seconds, I forgot where I was, forgot how inappropriate it all was. His words had peeled back something inside me that I'd kept hidden for too long. I looked down at my hand, which now rested mere inches from his, and he noticed. His thumb brushed the edge of my knuckle so gently that I wasn't sure if it had actually happened, or if I'd imagined it. We left the cafe, the weight of unspoken things hanging between us. The trees above formed a canopy of leaves that muted the world around us. The street was just beyond the park's edge, but here it felt like we were in a different time altogether, removed from reality. Alex slowed his steps and turned toward me, his expression unreadable. "Linda." His voice was quieter now, low enough that it almost felt like a confession. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, he closed the space between us. His hand cupped the side of my face gently, as though I might shatter. And then his lips brushed mine, warm and hesitant at first, as if seeking permission. For a moment I let myself get lost in it. There was no ticking clock, no thoughts of what came after, only the quiet crackle of leaves underfoot and the fire spreading in my chest. But reality is a stubborn thing. I pulled away, breathless and unsteady. His hand lingered at my cheek for a second before falling away. My pulse was racing. I searched his face, expecting, I wasn't sure what, guilt, regret. But there was only quiet longing, mirrored in my own reflection. "I should go," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. Alex nodded, but his eyes didn't leave mine. "Take care, Linda," he said softly. I turned, clutching Bruno's leash like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. My steps felt foreign as I walked home, the autumn breeze pulling at my coat. The kiss still burned on my lips, a reminder of the line I had just crossed. When I reached the house, George was in the kitchen, humming as he poured himself coffee. The sight was so familiar, so comforting, and yet it hit me like a splash of cold water. "Did you have a good walk?" he asked, glancing up with his usual easy smile. I forced myself to return it. "Yes, it was refreshing." As I stood there, watching him move around the kitchen, I felt two things at once: a deep, gnawing guilt, and a wild, unshakable yearning that refused to let go. The morning sky was overcast, casting a silvery glow over the driveway as George loaded the car trunk with a cooler and picnic bag. His excitement was almost boyish. "A day out at the gallery will do you good," he said, flashing me a grin as he placed a blanket inside. "You've been distracted lately." I offered a faint smile, clutching my purse tighter. Distracted was an understatement. Every nerve in my body seemed attuned to the fact that Alex was joining us. It was George's idea to invite him along, an innocent gesture. But for me, it was like being asked to walk a tightrope with no net. The low hum of tyres on the road filled the car as we drove out of town. I sat in the passenger seat while George navigated the winding roads. From the back seat, I felt Alex's gaze on me, steady, unblinking. I forced myself to focus on the passing scenery, golden fields, the distant silhouette of hills, a cluster of houses that grew smaller and smaller as we sped past. But I wasn't fooling anyone. "So," George began, adjusting the radio knob. "Alex, how's the city treating you?" Alex's voice was calm, even casual. "It's been good, but it's nice to get away for a bit." I swallowed hard, staring straight ahead, even as I felt the weight of his words settle in the space between us. The gallery was tucked away in a quiet, scenic area. White walls framed by large windows gave it a serene, almost sacred feel. Inside, the faint hum of classical music played as we walked through halls filled with paintings and sculptures. George lingered near an abstract installation, humming his approval. I, however, kept moving, needing space to breathe. That's when I noticed Alex trailing behind me, quiet but deliberate. My pulse quickened as I stepped into a smaller, dimly lit room at the end of the hall. We were alone. He closed the distance between us with slow, measured steps, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his jacket. But his eyes, those weren't casual at all. "When?" he whispered, barely more than a breath. I turned toward the painting on the wall, a portrait of a woman draped in emerald green fabric, her expression unreadable. I stared at it like it held some answer, some clue on how to handle the chaos swirling inside me. "This is madness," I murmured. Alex moved closer until his shoulder brushed mine. "You didn't answer my question." The air felt impossibly thin, like the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. When can I see you again? He asked, his voice low, almost pleading. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the warmth of him so close. The word never danced on the tip of my tongue, but refused to take shape. Instead, I let out a shaky breath and whispered, I don't know. George's voice cut through the tension like a cold gust of wind. Linda, there you are. I stepped back instinctively, smoothing my hair as though that simple gesture could erase the past few moments. Alex exhaled quietly, shoving his hands deeper into his pockets as George walked in, his brow furrowed. You've been standing here all alone? George chuckled and glanced at the painting. Not your usual style, huh? I forced a laugh. No, but it's compelling. George gave me a bemused look, his eyes narrowing just slightly. You're smiling like you're in on some joke. My heart lurched. I could feel Alex's presence beside me, though I avoided looking at him. I was just lost in thought, I replied, lifting my chin. George shrugged, his good nature quickly overriding his curiosity. Well, come on. There's a beautiful landscape exhibit in the next room. I nodded, stepping away as though crossing an invisible threshold. Alex lingered behind for just a beat longer before following. The rest of the afternoon felt like a tightrope act. Every time Alex moved closer, I shifted away, desperate to maintain a semblance of normalcy under George's watchful but unsuspecting eyes. And yet I caught myself stealing glances too, moments when the line between danger and desire blurred just enough to make me wonder how long I could keep pretending. When we finally left the gallery and stepped into the open air again, the world seemed too bright, too real. George chatted animatedly about his favourite pieces as we loaded back into the car, but as I settled into my seat, I dared a glance into the rearview mirror. Alex's reflection met mine, steady and unflinching. My heart pounded in my chest, but I turned away, focusing on George's familiar profile as he started the engine. The trip back home was filled with George's laughter and anecdotes, but I barely registered his words. The gallery had felt like a threshold, and I knew deep down that I'd already stepped across it. The cafe buzzed with quiet morning chatter, the clink of coffee cups, the murmur of conversations blending with the hum of the espresso machine. I spotted Sally at our usual table by the window, already sipping her tea. She waved me over with her usual energy, her bracelets jingling as she gestured. Linda, darling, you look like you haven't slept in days, she said, narrowing her eyes as I slid into the seat across from her. I gave a weak smile, wrapping my hands around the warm mug the server placed in front of me. I've had a lot on my mind. Sally's smile faltered as she leaned forward, her eyes scanning my face. Is it George? Is he all right? I shook my head. No, it's not George. Her brow furrowed, and I could see the concern etched into every line of her face. Sipping my coffee gave me a brief reprieve from answering, but I knew I couldn't keep it inside anymore. It's Alex, I finally admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Sally's eyes widened, but her reaction wasn't as shocked as I'd feared. She set her cup down carefully and waited, giving me space to continue. I can't explain it, I said, my words tumbling out faster now. There's something about him. The way he looks at me, the way I feel when he's near. It's wrong, I know it's wrong, but I can't stop it. I'm drawn to him in a way that terrifies me. Sally's lips curved into a wry smile. Well, she said, arching a brow, it's certainly more exciting than knitting Afghans and talking about bunions. I blinked, then let out a breathless laugh despite myself. Sally, this is serious. I know, she said, her smile softening. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Linda, you're allowed to feel things. You're human. But it's a fire you can't control. You need to decide if you're willing to risk being burned. Her words sank into me like stones dropped in water, rippling outward. I knew she was right. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains as I stood in the kitchen, scrubbing a plate harder than necessary. My reflection in the window was unfamiliar, tense, restless, caught in some invisible snare. I had to distance myself. I had to regain control. Over the next few days, I buried myself in household tasks. I scrubbed the floors, rearranged the bookshelves, and even reorganized the linen closet, a space I hadn't touched in years. I told myself that the ache in my chest was simply fatigue, that if I stayed busy enough, I wouldn't think about Alex. But it was a lie. Every room held a memory. The hallway, where I'd first brushed past him. The kitchen, where we'd shared that midnight moment. Even the garden seemed to hum with echoes of words never spoken aloud. Each night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling while George slept soundly beside me. I envied his peace, his simplicity. He didn't wrestle with ghosts in the dark. He wasn't haunted by the memory of a single touch. On the third day I found it, the note. It was tucked inside my favourite book, one I kept by the living room chair. My breath caught as I unfolded the small piece of paper, the handwriting unmistakably his. "You are my obsession." The words were sharp and simple, cutting through every wall I'd tried to build around myself. My fingers tightened around the paper until it crumpled, the edges digging into my palm. For a moment, I felt fury. At him, at myself, at the entire impossible situation. But the anger was fleeting, dissolving into something deeper. I could have thrown it away, I should have. But instead, I smoothed the paper out with trembling hands and read it again. And again. Somehow, knowing that I haunted him just as much as he haunted me didn't bring relief. It only made the weight of it heavier. I sat down slowly, the note still clutched between my fingers. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. Outside, I could hear Bruno barking in the yard, his joyful noise a sharp contrast to the storm inside me. Alex's words weren't just a confession, they were a challenge, a reminder that I wasn't as free as I pretended to be. I closed my eyes, the paper softening under the heat of my hand. His obsession, my downfall, and the worst part. I didn't want to let it go. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless expanse as we drove toward the coast, the early morning sun casting long shadows over the highway. George had been unusually cheerful all morning, humming as he packed our things into the car. "It'll be good to breathe some sea air," he had said, beaming at me as if this simple trip would be enough to clear away whatever storm lingered between us. I tried to mirror his enthusiasm, but the smile felt thin. Alex sat in the back seat, silent but calm. His presence was as steady as a heartbeat, a quiet pulse I couldn't ignore. The closer we got to the coast, the more the salty breeze began to seep through the cracks of the windows, carrying with it the familiar scent of freedom. The beach stretched out before us, golden and unspoiled. The waves lapped rhythmically at the shore, their steady rise and fall matching the thrum of my nerves. George spread a blanket near the dunes and began unpacking the cooler, his face lit with simple joy. "I'll grab some lemonade from the kiosk," he said, brushing sand off his hands. "Be right back." I nodded, watching as he disappeared up the wooden steps toward the boardwalk. The wind tugged at my hair, sending loose strands fluttering around my face. I turned toward the horizon, letting the vastness of the ocean quiet the noise in my mind. Then I felt it. A shift in the air behind me. A presence that sent a ripple down my spine. "Linda." Alex's voice was low, almost carried away by the breeze. I didn't turn immediately. My eyes stayed on the waves as though if I focused hard enough, I could hold my composure. Footsteps crunched softly in the sand as he moved closer until I felt the warmth of him beside me. His hand brushed against my shoulder, hesitant yet deliberate. Do you feel it too? He asked quietly. I closed my eyes for a moment, willing my heart to slow down. The air between us felt thin, stretched taut by things left unsaid. Yes, I whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. The sky was ablaze with the amber glow of sunset, the ocean gilded in gold. In that fleeting moment, the world felt far away, nothing but the whisper of waves and the hum of my pulse. Alex turned toward me, his gaze searching mine with an urgency that made my breath catch. Before I could speak, his hand slid gently to my cheek, his thumb brushing against my skin as though memorizing its texture. And then he kissed me, deep and unrestrained, like a wave crashing against the shore. The wind wrapped around us, tangling my hair, pulling us closer, even as reason begged me to pull away. But there was no reasoning in that moment. There was only the raw pull of gravity, of inevitability. His lips were warm, tasting faintly of salt and something sweeter, something that felt like surrender. When I finally broke away, the air felt colder without him. My heart raced, but not from the wind. I pressed my fingers to my lips, still warm from the kiss, as the weight of what I'd done settled over me. I felt the pull to stay in that fragile, reckless moment for just a second longer, but the sound of footsteps on the boardwalk jolted me back to reality. George's voice drifted toward us, light and carefree. "Got the lemonade?" Alex stepped back immediately, his face unreadable as he moved toward the water's edge, pretending to admire the waves. I forced myself to steady my breath as George appeared with 2 plastic cups, his smile bright and oblivious. "You'll love this. It's fresh squeezed," he said, handing me a cup. I took it with a trembling hand, hoping the chill of the lemonade would cool the fire coursing through me. "Thanks," I murmured, managing a smile. George threw an arm around my shoulders, his warmth familiar and steady. I leaned into him, though my mind drifted to Alex, who stood just a few feet away, his silhouette framed by the fading light. The sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in shades of violet and crimson. I could still feel Alex's touch like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. George didn't notice the tremor in my hand as I sipped from the cup. But I noticed it. The line I'd sworn never to cross had shattered beneath the weight of that kiss. And there was no way to take it back. The rhythmic hum of the washing machine filled the laundry room as I sorted through a pile of clothes. The task was monotonous, exactly what I needed to drown out the thoughts that had been circling my mind since last night. The events at the beach, Marjorie's knowing glances, Alex's unexpected visit. It all felt like a whirlwind I couldn't escape. Bruno padded into the room, his tail wagging in lazy arcs as he nosed around the baskets. "Not now, boy," I muttered, half smiling as I leaned forward to grab a stray sock that had fallen behind the machine. Suddenly, I felt a warm nudge against the back of my legs. Bruno, oblivious to my frustration, gave me a playful shove with his nose. "Bruno!" I exclaimed, laughing despite myself as I lost my balance and pressed my hand against the edge of the washing machine to steady myself. His bark was sharp and excited, echoing through the small space like a reminder that life was still, in its own odd way, normal. I straightened, brushing a loose strand of hair from my face as Bruno wagged his tail victoriously. "Okay, okay. You win," I sighed, scratching behind his ears. His happy bark lingered in the air as I returned to folding clothes, but the moment of levity was fleeting. The silence that followed seemed heavier than before. The doorbell rang and my heart skipped, not from fear, but from something far more difficult to explain. Alex stood there, hands in the pockets of his dark coat, his face calm but guarded. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I hesitated, but only for a moment. I stepped aside, letting him enter. The house felt smaller with him inside, as if the walls themselves were bracing for whatever came next. "I didn't know you'd come back," I said, folding my arms as if that could hold me together. He offered a small, almost apologetic smile. I won't be here long. I wanted to tell you in person. I've accepted the internship abroad. I leave at the end of the week. The words fell between us like stones, heavy and final. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to nod. That's wonderful, I whispered, though it felt like a betrayal of everything I'd been holding inside. Alex's eyes softened. I thought you should know. I didn't want to disappear without saying goodbye. I looked down, focusing on the floorboards beneath my feet. The pain felt dull at first, like an echo of something deeper, but it grew sharper with every second. You'll be great there, I said, willing my voice to stay steady. You deserve it. He stepped closer, his hand brushing mine for the briefest moment. I felt the warmth of him, but I didn't move. For once, neither of us reached for what we couldn't have. We stood by the door, the weight of 1,000 unspoken things between us. The sunlight filtering through the window caught the edges of his face, painting him in shades of gold. Take care of yourself, I whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. Alex's eyes lingered on mine, searching for something. An answer, maybe, or permission to hold on just a little longer. But he didn't ask. You too, he murmured. I reached for the door handle, forcing myself to open it wide. The outside world rushed in, a breeze carrying the scent of autumn leaves and distant laughter from the street. Alex stepped outside, pausing for only a second before continuing down the path. I watched him go, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared over the horizon. The door creaked as I slowly closed it, sealing the moment away. The sound of the front gate brought me back to the present. George's voice called out cheerfully as he entered the house. Linda, I'm home. I wiped my eyes quickly, though no tears had fallen. By the time George stepped into the room, I was already turning toward him with a familiar smile. He pulled me into a warm embrace, his coat cool against my cheek. I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into his steady presence. You're freezing, I said softly, wrapping my arms around him. George laughed, oblivious to the storm that had passed through this house only minutes before. It's brisk out there, but I brought something to warm us up, fresh bread and your favourite soup. I nodded against his chest, inhaling the familiar scent of him, coffee and cedarwood soap. I felt comforted and hollow at once, weighed down by the ache of what I had hidden away. As George spoke about his day, I listened, nodding at the right moments, my smile as steady as ever. But a small voice whispered in the back of my mind, a quiet echo of Alex's final words and the brush of his hand against mine. Some secrets never leave you. They weave themselves into the fabric of your soul, invisible but unbreakable. I had chosen to stay in this life, in this quiet rhythm. But the memory of Alex would always live there, tucked away like a pressed flower in the pages of a book, a secret only I would ever know.